From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, speaking to you from Los Angeles, California. My co-host David Feldman in New York City. And of course, the man of the hour, speaking to us from Connecticut this week, Ralph Nader. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Steve and David.
David, we have a very interesting guest this week. Tell us who we have.
Well, Steve, our guest is Frances Crowe. She comes to us from Western Massachusetts. In the 1960s, Frances founded the Northampton chapter of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Sane Nuclear Policy Committee, and the Valley Peace Center. Frances has run the American Friends Service Committee from her Northampton home for several decades. For her lifelong commitment to the peace movement and her opposition to war through war tax resistance, she was awarded the Courage of Conscience Award in 2007. Ralph, please welcome Frances Crowe.
It's a delight to welcome a true historic American person who has done so many things that shame other people, because she not only organizes peace groups and anti-nuclear power groups, she's right on the line in terms of nonviolent, open civil disobedience. And when my sister gave Frances Crowe the Joe A. Calloway Award for Civic Courage in 2009 in Washington, D.C., I asked Frances, how many times has she been arrested in all of these nonviolent, open civil disobediences at nuclear submarine ports, at nuclear power plants, largely in New England? And I never forgot her answer. When I said, Frances, how many times have you been arrested? She says, not enough. And here we are. Welcome, Frances Crowe. Welcome. And I'd like to start out by saying, how did you get into this kind of dramatic, open, informed type of advocacy with others that often foreshadow real changes? These are not demonstrations that are pie in the sky. And as we'll find out shortly, Frances was an early demonstrator repeatedly and got arrested repeatedly at the Vermont nuclear plant. And we'll see what happened to that nuclear plant as a result of all the protests. How did you start out in New Orleans? Why don't you give that story way back in World War II?
I slowly woke up to what was going on in World War II by, I think, chiefly being in New York City and reading a little 4-page newsletter that came out every day, PM. And I learned that you don't always get all the news in the New York Times, or you get one aspect of the news. It's very well presented, but it took a while. And I really was startled by our dropping the nuclear bomb at Hiroshima and then at Nagasaki, and was just driven out to look for a nonviolent solution to this problem of violence and war and power. And I'm still looking.
And you were in New Orleans, wasn't it, when you heard about Hiroshima, which was, for those who are not up on it, it was in August of 1945. President Harry Truman ordered the first atomic bomb on a civilian population in Hiroshima. It wasn't much of a military target. And that decision, as subsequent records revealed, was opposed by many of the top generals like General George C. Marshall and others as unnecessary. The Japanese were essentially defeated, and we weren't about to fight door to door in Japan and incur all the casualties. So tell me, when you heard on the radio, you were ironing, you said, and you heard on the radio, what happened?
Well, my husband was overseas. He was a physician in the infantry, and he was about to come back, and he had told me that there was a rumor that we were developing this atomic bomb, and he was planning to go into radiology, so he knew what it was about. And when I heard on the radio that we had dropped this bomb, and we didn't know what the effects of it were right away, but I know it was enormous. It really wiped out the town of Hiroshima. And it wasn't until much later that we really understood the devastation. But I went out on the streets of New Orleans looking for a peace center, and I didn't find one. But I found a used bookstore, and the proprietor told me that I should start reading Tolstoy and understand what the solution would be, nonviolence. So I started on my path. And so slowly I began to wake up what was going on in the society around me. And then we were testing these nuclear weapons in the atmosphere out in Nevada, and the radioactive isotopes would be picked up by the clouds and often brought over west of the Hudson River, where the rain would fall on the pastures and the cows would be eating the grass, and the radioactive isotopes would be in the milk. So I started trying to corner the powdered milk available. Then my kids wouldn't drink the powdered milk. So I decided there had to be a political solution. So that's when I really began seriously organizing.
Well, you know, the Daily Hampshire Gazette had an article on you, and they quote someone saying, Frances Crowe is the kind of activist who makes others tired just watching her, end quote. But what you do by your activity and by your behavior and being on the front lines is you attract a lot of other people who never really knew how to do open, active civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience. You help train them. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the remarkable demonstrations you were part of and the result. Let's start with the demonstration at Westover Air Force Base in Chicopee, Massachusetts. You had one on International Women's Day, and you were part of a group called Women Against War. And what happened to that armed bomber pilot who was assigned to watch you as you were demonstrating? Great story.
That's right. We went out and we knelt down to block the gate, and we were dressed as Vietnamese people with the conical hats and black trousers and jacket. And he saw us, and he didn't know what had happened, but that night he was watching West Side Story, I think, on television with his wife, and he started crying. And he said he couldn't really stop crying. And he was going back to Butipal, Thailand, where he was stationed. And when he got back, he went to see the chaplain, and he decided that it was because he had come to face the fact what he was doing as a bomber pilot. And he saw us when he looked at the crossbars of the target. He saw the Vietnamese as people. And so he decided he was a conscientious objector and he could no longer bomb. And I heard on the radio the next day that he was the first bomber pilot in the war who had asked for a discharge because of conscience. And his mother came on the air saying, it was a broadcast from Danbury, Connecticut, saying that her son was not a conscientious objector. She didn't feel, because his father had been in World War II, and he would have fought in World War II. Well, I called her up and said, the law says if you're conscientiously opposed to participation in war in any form facing you, you are a conscientious objector. He didn't have to say would have done World War II because he was not alive then. So eventually I sent him a lot of material. The mother gave me the APO number and I sent him the material. And when he got back to Westover, he called me, and I went down and helped him.
And he was court-martialed. His name was Captain Donald Dawson. But he was assigned to watch you as you all knelt down to block the base's main gate, and you were reading Vietnamese poetry at the time.
Yes.
He was an armed bomber pilot in Vietnam who was home on rest and recreation, and it was a transforming moment in his life. And I always thought that was an example of the power of your demonstrations. Tell us about your approach to the nuclear power plant in Vermont and what you did and what the status of that plant is now. I love this story.
It's been shut down. I'm going up tomorrow night to a nuclear regulatory hearing because the corporation doesn't want to spend very much money shutting it down safely. But we feel, or Shut It Down Affinity Group feels, that those spent fuel rods sitting up on the banks of the Connecticut River in a serious storm or an earthquake, we could have, a Fukushima here. There are more spent fuel rods up there now than were at Fukushima. And the spent fuel rods have the nuclear power of 800 nuclear weapons sitting up there exposed on the banks of the Connecticut River.
And you did a yeoman job year after year demonstrating. How many times were you arrested there?
I don't know. Not enough, obviously, but I think it's probably about 20 times.
That raises an interesting point, which is a lot of these demonstrators really who are looked askance on are predicting the future. I think once you said, quote, once people believed in human sacrifice, not anymore. Once people believed in slavery, not anymore. Once people believed that women should not vote, not anymore. In your lifetime, I hope your children can say, once people believed in war is the answer, not anymore. What a great statement. And then you basically say what the advantage is of having white hair and what the elderly can do for the rest of us.
That's right. I'm 95. Will be 96 in a couple of weeks.
Bless you.
Wow.
But, I think one of the great achievements in my life is getting Democracy Now! On the radio and on television every day at Northampton.
Yes, that's a story because in some places in New England you can't get Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! And one of them was where you lived. Tell us what you did about it when the public radio station there would not carry Democracy Now!
They didn't, said it wasn't their kind of programming, so I worked with a very good young man who knew how to do things technically, and he had been walking up to the top of Mount Tom and throwing with a battery, and he downloaded the program and threw it up in a tree and broadcast it all over illegally. And then they were going to close the park for the winter, and he couldn't do it. No one would do it who had a tall building, wouldn't put an antenna up to do it. So I said, let's try my backyard. And so he came over the next day, threw an antenna up in my walnut tree, and then he drove around town and said it was coming through very well. So I bought a transmitter and got a carpenter to put up a pole in my backyard with the antenna. So I broadcasted illegally for a year and a half. And then when the radio station, WFCR, learned that I was doing this, and we had an alternative pledge campaign. We asked people not to pledge money to National Public Radio until they broadcast Democracy Now! So they asked me to come over because we were successful there. $40,000 was withheld in a week. So they agreed to broadcast it, download it, and stream it over to the college radio station, if the college radio station would broadcast it. So it took another year for me to convince the college to do it. But eventually they did. and it's been on the air now 10 years, and they love it, and they feel it's done more for the station than anything else. So Amy Goodman came up last year, and we had a celebration.
This is the University of Massachusetts Amherst radio station,
yes.
WMUA. I hear it from time to time.
I have a question, Ralph.
Yeah.
Frances, where have you been all my life?
Oh, we've been here trying to do things.
I think I'm in love.
You know,
I have to go get a glass of water. I'm getting lightheaded.
but
Well, once Frances told the Boston Globe, quote, people my age have been lulled into the idea that they shouldn't take risks, that they should stay comfortable and take the easy way. But we've lived our lives, and we have nothing to lose. No kids or jobs to worry about. I say to them, have some fun. Get out there and join the community of people acting on their beliefs, end quote. You think AARP is doing enough to get people active?
No, I don't belong to AARP. I have my own plan. I think you have to have a passion, act on it. And that's what my book is about, is how you find your passion and how it feeds the future passion.
We're talking with Frances Crowe, a fantastic active citizen out of Western Massachusetts with a national impact over the years. She's just about to publish her memoirs. And why don't you tell us the title and how people can get it through a 1-800 number, Frances?
Yes. It's called Frances Crowe, Finding My Radical Soul. It's a memoir, and you can get it by paperback edition, 800-215-8805. Order it from Haley's Press.
It's 100-215-8805.
Yes.
And you'll see a tremendously motivating life story. You take it all away, Frances. You're a tax resistor. Why don't you explain that to our audience?
Well, I no longer pay federal taxes. I write them a letter and say that my conscience won't permit me.
I thought you were Apple. I'm sorry.
No, I file my tax return and write them a letter, and I have given all my assets. I've set up a trust for my children so that they take 15% out of my Social Security, but that's it.
So explain to me how that works. So you write a letter saying that you cannot pay your federal taxes because you don't like that it's being spent for war.
Well, I am opposed to war. And I'm working. My life is devoted to stopping war and the violence in our culture.
So is that like being a conscientious tax objector?
I'm conscientiously opposed to participation in war.
And how does the federal government respond to that?
Well, they come and take 15% out of my Social Security, but that's all they can get.
I see.
And how long have you been doing this?
6 years, I think.
You know, you were talking about where you've been arrested around the country, and something stood out. You said the worst place to be imprisoned when you're a nonviolent, open, civil, disobedient person. The worst place to be imprisoned was Washington, D.C., because they take your glasses away from you and your shoes.
That's right. They did when I was arrested, yes. And we were arrested in the White House because we went in on a tour, and we spoke out when we got in the dining room about what the government was doing.
Which White House was this, Frances?
The White House in Washington, D.C.
No, I know that White House, but which administration, I should have said. Who was president?
Oh, I don't remember.
But it was not recently. It was probably Nixon or somebody like that.
Yes.
One of your dramatizations, which really caught my attention, was what you called the BB demonstration for the audiences you speak to. Could you explain that?
Well, this is a wonderful demonstration to show people how many nuclear weapons we have. You get 2,000 BBs, and you put the BBs in plastic bags 3 different plastic bags and ask people to listen. As you drop a BB in a tin waste paper basket, which represents all of the firepower that we had used, including World War II. That would be like Dresden and the bombing of Tokyo. So that's 1 BB.
And that includes Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Yes, it includes Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
So that firepower is 1 BB, okay.
And then you drop 3 BBs, which represents the firepower that we have on a Trident submarine. And then 8 is a Poseidon.
In other words, in one submarine, there is more firepower by 8-fold than all the firepower that we used in World War II in European and Pacific theaters, including Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Yes.
And then how much more BBs do we have?
You know, the remainder of the BBs, 1,900 and minus 11. And all of those you pour in slowly in the can, and that represents what we have now.
And that's why we don't have enough money for repairing our schools and our public transit and our sewage and water systems. It's all going into weaponry.
And our bridges and giving health care for all and free college education.
Tell us about your work on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is coming up.
Well, it's coming up this spring, and what we're working now is trying to tell people about this treaty. And I've been working on the schedule for Elaine Scarry is coming out here on the 5th of March to speak at Amherst College and at Smith. We found some students at Amherst who had read her book. She is a philosopher teaching at Harvard and wrote a very fine book called Nuclear Monarchy. And so she's coming out to talk about this because she feels that it is unconstitutional for us to leave the decision of responding with a nuclear weapon to the president. You know, this launch-on warning, if they think, you know, if a flock of geese flies over one of the radar stations, as was threatened 2 years ago in Norway, and it was up to the Russians whether or not they would launch a nuclear weapon. And at that time, the president hesitated, which was very good until they checked more. And that, you know, is the problem. I don't think that the president, anyone, should have the singular authority to be rational enough at that time to make the decision alone.
We still have nuclear weapons in the U.S. and in Russia that are aimed, ready to fire, and it's 30 minutes, it could destroy both countries.
Yes. And this is crazy to spend all that money for something that is used only to threaten and never really planned to be used.
Unless there's an accidental launch, and that's a problem too, right?
That is the problem. And many are out on submarines that are not in very good shape. I don't want to spend any money building new submarines, but I think that's probably what will happen.
You're going to have a gallery exhibition at Smith College, Frances, showing newly discovered photos of the aftermath of Hiroshima, the massive deaths, 200,000 or so, that were stored in an attic by Norman Cousins, the famous editor of the Saturday Review. Is that going to happen?
Yes, that has happened. I have the pictures.
And it has happened already?
We've had it last year, yes, last spring. We had the exhibit at Smith. And now I have the pictures in my living room under the couch that I hope to get. We will have an exhibit It hasn't happened yet, but we're working on it.
Has AARP's magazine that goes to 15, 18 million people, I'm told, have they ever interviewed you?
No.
I guess you're too active for them, right?
Yes.
Are you going to go on a tour in New England when the book comes out? Or
Well, I'm glad to go wherever I'm invited. I'm going to be at the Odyssey bookstore in 2 weeks, and I've done one book signing, and I'm going to do one in Greenfield, but I'm happy to go wherever people invite me.
Well, Frances, Steve, and David, are you totally exhausted now listening to all this?
I'm
Do you have a question for Frances?
Well, I'm going to be polite and let Steve ask. I have a question, but Steve?
Well, I just want to know, Ralph, Frances has been arrested 20 times, and I think you haven't been arrested.
Yankee.
Just at Vermont Yankee.
90.
90. And Ralph, she's making you look like a piker because I don't think you've ever been arrested.
No,
What have you been doing in your career?
As I say, I'd rather be a plaintiff than a defendant, but I have nothing but awe and respect for the times that Frances Crowe was hauled away by the police, sometimes roughly, to spend a few days or a few weeks in prison when she's fighting for a non-nuclear world and peace and justice. I'm very happy to see, Frances, that you're just getting going. And I want to see this book really get read. And I'm going to try to do everything I can to get radio and TV stations to pay attention to the lessons of your life, which millions of elderly Americans might be interested in as they retire and wonder whether the society values them anymore. That doesn't have to be a question asked of you, though.
Yes, well, Ralph, a lot is going on around the country. I'm sure, as you are well aware of, all of these climate action groups and the question they're raising about the militarization of the police and racism and trying to create jobs and getting people to eat local produce only. And the students around here are very concerned about the high cost of education. So there's a lot going on all over the country that nobody tells us about it. So I think it's good that you're holding up what's happening locally.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, David.
And Ralph could answer this too. What do you say to people who are so worn down and they believe that it's a dangerous world out there? And yes, we shouldn't be spending $75 billion on this bomber and submarine, but it's a dangerous world out there. Better we have these weapons than somebody else.
Well, I think that we're causing more violence in the world than anybody else. And you have to begin to really look at your priorities.
Doesn't work either. Almost all wars, David, are preventable. World War I was clearly preventable. Bunch of hotheads running a few of these European nations, and their ego got involved, and 20 million people died. And that led to the crushing effect of the Versailles Treaty on Germany, where they wanted to crush its economy, and they had total devastation and destitution, and that was a fertile ground for Adolf Hitler, which led to World War II. So I think Frances has proved that the causes that she has advanced, and she's been on the front lines with nonviolent open civil disobedience and writing and speaking, those causes have materialized. I mean, women's rights, gay, lesbian rights, the arms control treaties, which even Ronald Reagan engaged in with the Soviet Union, those were stimulated by massive marches in New York, Washington, and around the country. So I don't think the biography of Frances Crowe is anything but a success story, not tilting at windmills. You have to start out being accused of tilting at windmills, but she's been a great success story,
Absolutely.
Along with all the others who quietly performed their civic duties.
Good luck bringing back the draft. That's one of your great successes.
the draft is not the answer. I think that it might be very helpful if we had community service for young people. And I have a granddaughter who is working on hunger in America under AmeriCorps. And I think that's very good service.
I was speaking to what Ralph was saying, is that...
I think, David, I think there's bipartisan support for that.
Yeah, but I was saying that's part of her success, is that Americans don't want to serve anymore.
Yeah.
And that you couldn't get people to serve now. I think that speaks to the success of the protest movement.
That's right. And what did you say about white hair in closing, Frances?
White hair. Oh, it's easy to keep. I like it. I think, those of us who have changing colors of our hair, it's good for us to be out there in the trenches, active, working hard.
Indomitable. Thank you very much, Frances Crowe.
Yes. Thank you, Ralph. Great to talk to you. You're doing great work yourself.
Well, thank you. And we're going to talk about your forthcoming book, your memoir, which will be out next month. People who want to order it, just call 1-800-215-8805.
Yes. Great.
Thank you again, Frances.
Thank you. All right.
Okay.
Bye.
We've been talking to peace activist Frances Crowe, whose new book is called Frances Crowe, Finding My Radical Soul. And as Ralph just mentioned, you can order it from Haley Press at 800-215-8805. That's 800-215-8805. And you can also buy the book at findingmyradicalsoul.com. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We will be back right after this.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, nader.org. Don't forget to subscribe to the Ralph Nader newsletter for free by going to nader.org, and you can get Ralph Nader in your mailbox once a week. Ralph, 2 weeks ago, we were talking to attorney and constitutional scholar Bruce Fein about our foreign interventions in the Middle East, and we discussed our actions along with the French and British in toppling Gaddafi in Libya. Ralph, you want to talk about what is going on in Libya right now?
Well, it's another example of a preventable conflagration that's spreading in all directions. Gaddafi was a dictator in Libya, and in the years before we toppled him, he was trying to make amends. He had scuttled whatever there was of his weapons of mass destruction under international inspection. He was cutting deals with U.S. oil companies. And suddenly, Hillary Clinton decided that it would be a good thing to overturn him and create democracy in Libya, as if she knew anything about Libya and the tribes and all the dynamics. Well, he was toppled with a lot of U.S., British, and French bombing, but the money and the logistics were heavily U.S. Secretary of Defense Gates opposed Hillary Clinton, but he lost because Hillary Clinton persuaded Barack Obama. All right, so they toppled Gaddafi, and what has been the result? Total disaster. Libya now is in flames. It's in sectarian violence between militias. There is no safety in the streets. The economy is at a standstill. There are huge militias fighting each other for the oil ports and the oil exports. The toppling of Colonel Gaddafi led to fighters going into Central Africa, fleeing. At the time, they brought heavy weapons with them. Mali blew up. Central Africa now is considered a very dangerous haven for fighters against the West. We have special forces in there. The refugees fleeing Libya have drowned in the hundreds trying to cross on leaky rafts and boats the Mediterranean Sea to get to Italy or Greece or any place that would accept them. This is Hillary's war. And this is a perfect example of what Coleman McCarthy, who we had on the program earlier, the great peace educator, talked about. and what Frances Crowe has devoted her life to, is that waging peace leads to preventing war. And if we don't wake up as citizens, if we don't wake up so that we speak through Washington, rather than Washington and the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about decide when, where, and how we go to aggressive wars, we're going to continue to devour our own country. All empires devour themselves. They devour themselves in terms of budgets, the wreckage of the economy, and the priorities that are totally upside down. And in so doing, they make more enemies abroad, more fighters, more convulsions, just as we've seen Al-Qaeda offshoots and the Islamic State now threatening in over 12 countries, something that started in a mountain redoubt in Afghanistan. Our great drone successes and our invasions have metastasized a massive radical uprising against anybody that they think stands in their way. So that's the lesson of Libya. I hope that it becomes a major issue in the coming presidential campaign. It isn't the Benghazi consulate issue. It's the total destabilization of a country that spills over into instability and violence in Africa. It's now affecting Egypt. Egyptian planes just bombed some of the Islamic State so-called fighters who slaughtered the Coptics in Libya. It's spreading everywhere. Politicians have to become accountable by the facts of history and the principles of peace and justice. And that's what I think the lesson of Libya, which is unfolding in terrible manners as we speak. And I was very pleased to see the lead editorial of the New York Times recount under an editorial titled The Unraveling of Libya what is happening over there and our responsibility for that.
Ralph, just to play devil's advocate here, we've got two cases in recent history. Libya is one that you've talked about, in Syria. And as I recall, in Libya, the question was there was a revolution brewing in Libya, and we were going to prevent Gaddafi from massacring and wiping out the people who were spawning that revolution. We intervened there. In Syria, it seems like something similar was happening with Assad, and we did not intervene. It looks like the same result in both places.
There's a generic response here, and that is, why are we over there at all for 100 years with the British and the French, carving them up, propping up dictators, laying the groundwork for contemporary violence and rebellion and resistance and massacres? All right, so the answer is, okay, regardless of history, what do we do now? Well, the one thing we've got to do is make sure we don't make things worse. And all we're doing is just making things worse. Now, when Gaddafi started to move on the eastern city in Libya where the revolt started, of course he said, well, we're going to slaughter anybody in our way. But as has been pointed out, the verbal bravado of Gaddafi was not necessarily going to play out in terms of the slaughter of a formidable resistance that was building in Benghazi. So if we have to see the results of our terrible historical policies play out, and we got to do something as the nations together, it could have been an international expedition to protect the people of Benghazi, but not overthrow a dictatorship when you know, if you knew anything about the tribal segmentation and the situation in Libya, it's just going to be massively worse. If you had a poll now of Libyans, most of whom did not like Gaddafi, even though he raised oil prices enormously when he told the OPEC cartel to go from $3 to $5 or more a barrel in those days. If you polled them today, they would say, bring back Gaddafi rather than the present situation. So that's what we have to ask. Now, I'm always for international peacekeeping forces, but I'm for diplomacy and foreign policy that does not lead with brute force, because that always backfires. It blowbacks, may not blow back directly on the U.S. immediately, but it blowbacks on destabilizing the people in those countries and fomenting the constant sectarian divisions and attacks using Western weapons, Western intrigue, and Western money. We have to have a highly professional international peacekeeping group that can, in effect, enforce international law to prevent these kinds of slaughters. But it'd be a good step first if we had a diplomacy of muscular peace heading off the situations. As far as Syria is concerned, we had the same dilemma. We would use Assad to send people that we captured for torture. That was called extraordinary rendition. And we played ball with him and his father a number of ways over the years. When the revolt occurred, again, you see, the situation is that too many outside influences. There was Turkey, there was Israel, there was Saudis, there was Qatar. So we have to step back and say, look, it's a terrible situation over there. How do we avoid making it worse? We stop selling arms is one. We stop sending drones is two. We stop dropping special forces all over. They even went into Iran for a period of time illegally. And we move for international peace treaties. The Arab League for over a decade now has on the table a comprehensive peace treaty with Israel and two-state solution. And this is a very serious presentation confirmed by the State Department. It's been published. And it represents dozens of Islamic countries, not just the Arab world. And there's been no response from the United States or Israel other than indifference or rejection. So that's where we are. And we've got to make the coming presidential campaign a major source of discussion and debate so that when we have these lethal slogans thrown out by people like Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush as if we haven't learned anything from what has happened in the last 20 years and after 9/11 and before 9/11.
So you think we did the right thing in not intervening militarily in Syria, but we were not proactive enough with some sort of diplomatic agenda?
Yeah, very, very little diplomacy, first of all. I mean, look at the State Department. It's supposed to be diplomatic arm of the U.S. government, and it's been militarized. We should have brought the parties together into a major treaty effort. The longer we delayed, the more difficult it was, obviously. But it's quite clear that we're playing one country and one dictator against another over there for many years, and it suddenly erupted and became out of control. We have to always ask ourselves, how did we get into this situation in order to find out how to get out of it? But, you know, decades ago, they'd have these international peace treaties. It seems like international law has fallen upon rough times these days.
All right, well, let's switch gears here to some domestic issues. Ralph, you recently sent a letter to United Airlines CEO Jeff Smizek. He's the friendly guy you see in the pre-flight video who tells you how hard United Airlines is working to make your trip safe and comfortable. I take it you weren't congratulating him on the Continental United merger. Is that a good assumption?
Yes, Steve. Some workers came to me and they said, we're working our heads off at Bradley International Airport. We're on the tarmac, dawn, wind, rain, storm. We're expected to perform, and we do. And now we hear from the management that they want to outsource our jobs. And I said, well, how much are you being paid? And they said $15 an hour plus benefits. And I said, Mr. Smizek wants to outsource your jobs? Yeah, they're outsourcing the jobs to vendors who say, well, we can replace these loyal United Airlines workers for $11 an hour. And then management of United Airlines throws this bid against the loyal workers and says, you willing to match it? And the latest move by United Airlines management affects 2,000 workers at 24 airports all over the country. They want to outsource the jobs. And they say it will save the airline $2.7 million a year. So I wrote the head of United Airlines, and I said, $2.7 million a year? Number one, are these new workers going to be as skilled and experienced so they can avoid mistakes and accidents when they're guiding these planes in and out of the jetway? And I said, you should be ashamed of yourself. You spent over $300 million of the passengers' money last year just buying back your stock so you can set the situation up for higher executive salaries, and you're already making millions of dollars a year. That's where we are now with U.S. business. United Airlines is registering record profits. The executives are registering record pay, and they want to save $2.7 million a year by de-skilling jobs and being disloyal to their loyal workers and outsourcing the jobs. Well, I put this on Huffington Post, and we got a massive response to it, Steve. A massive response. Why? The headline of the Huffington Post article was, United Airlines disloyal to loyal workers. And obviously that resonated with a lot of people who are not employed by United Airlines, but who have that same job anxiety, that no matter how many years they worked, and we got letters from United Airlines employees at 36 years one man had worked and is being set up for outsource. So this anxiety courses through millions of workers who think that someday they may get that message that they're being outsourced to reduce, quote, the cost structure of our company in order to remain competitive, end quote. I'm going to write United Airlines CEO another letter. This one is going to propose another way to reduce the airline's cost structure, is to put up for bid the jobs of the CEO and president of United Airlines to Asia, so that we can have an outsourced firm in Asia recruit bilingual Chinese and Indian airline executives with great successful experience who would be willing to work for 1/10 of the pay.
That's not a bad idea. Now, Ralph, you said that these airline workers came to you from Bradley International, which is in Hartford. When you say that, did they write you a letter? Did they call you up? How did they come to you?
I was at a public event, and a couple of them came up to me and told me what was happening. I said, when do you go to work? She said, we have to get up at 4 a.m. to go to Bradley, depending on if Bradley's open due to the winter. That's how I found out about it. I didn't find out about it by reading the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, or public radio. These stories are all over the place, but they need visibility.
Ralph, traditionally airlines lose money. Even though they're having a good year this year, eventually United Airlines is going to have to declare bankruptcy. How can we change the bankruptcy laws? Because these workers are going to get screwed even worse once United Airlines goes into bankruptcy.
Well, first of all, you won't have to worry about that for a number of years. All the airlines are registering record profits. You have lower oil prices, but they've also reduced capacity so that you don't see many half-empty planes the way you used to because they have fewer planes. They have merged, so there are only 4 major airlines now carving up the business domestically. So they're in a sweet spot. Years ago, they lost money year after year, except for Southwest Airlines. I might say Southwest Airlines is an exception to everything I've been saying on this. They have never laid off a worker, never. And they do not outsource jobs like that. The importance of the history of airlines is that they were mismanaged, they mistreated their passengers, they lost money, in part because of high fuel prices. All right, now they're in the catbird seat. And so how are they responding? Cruelly. I mean, you don't have workers who take concessions in the 80s and in the 90s, in the decade before. They take concessions because management says, our airline's in tough position. It's about to go bankrupt. You've got to give up some of your wages or your pensions or other benefits, et cetera. And they all did that to save their jobs. So now you have the great turnaround and huge profits, and is management expressing gratitude? No. They want to replace their jobs with lower paid outsourced companies.
Well, Ralph, I went on your Facebook page where you had posted the letter, and as you say, it's kind of blowing up with comments, and most of them were very supportive and positive. Of course, I found one here that was a little provocative, and here's what this person said, quote, he's referring to Jeff Smizek, his loyalty, as per his position with the company, is to the shareholders. Fair or not, that is who a CEO works for. If you do not like corporations, then fine, but don't call out an executive for doing exactly what he's paid to do.
If you don't treat your workers properly and you don't get productivity and you destroy the morale, the shareholders aren't going to have much to pocket. The first priority of a company is to pay attention to its workers and its customers. If they do that, the shareholders will do well. If a company does not pay attention to its workers and to its customers, it's going to do very badly, if not go bankrupt, and then the shareholders will be out in the cold. So, yeah.
Isn't there a new belief that legally corporations' first priority is not shareholders? Isn't that a misnomer?
It's a misnomer in terms of the court decision that's often referred to. It simply has reality because shareholders can file derivative suits attacking management for not performing their fiduciary responsibilities. And that can go either way based on the facts. But there's a new kind of corporation now that people can start called the Benefits Corporation, which explicitly says that the corporation can pay attention to non-shareholder issues without exposing itself to a shareholder derivative suit.
Right, but legally, CEOs are not bound to maximizing profits.
Exactly. I mean, they can exercise what the Securities Exchange Commission calls their, quote, business judgment. And their business judgment is very loosely defined as what the management thinks it is. So I think that's a fallacy when people think that management is legally obligated to put the shareholders' rights above all other stakeholders. Because obviously, if they did that, they could wreck the company. They could say, we're not going to open up a new plant because we want to give it in dividends to shareholders. Or they could say, we are not going to involve ourselves in research and development because we want to use the money to buy back stock and give the shareholders a better earnings per share ratio. You see that you're basically eating the seed corn of the company's destruction.
Which is what they do.
Yes, which is what they have been doing.
It's
why the steel industry and the auto industry and many other industries got into deep trouble years ago.
Well, we're heading into the home stretch here of the show. We have some time now. Let's take a couple of listener questions. David, do you want to pose the first one?
Rob Irwin writes, what are your thoughts on implementing none of the above as a valid ballot option in all U.S. federal and state elections?
I love none of the above because right now in America, you can only vote yes when you go to the polls. You cannot vote no. And none of the above is a line that you can go to the polls and vote for, which is a way of saying, I have no confidence in the candidates on the ballot. I want to register my no vote. If they had binding none of the above, and none of the above got more votes than, say, the candidates for mayor or the candidates for governor, it would cancel that election and order new candidates and a new election, say, in 60 days. None of the above will bring out more people to vote.
What is the difference between none of the above and undecided? When the pollsters call, they never ask you none of the above. You get listed as undecided.
Yes, that's a way of basically dismissing the non-voter as being indecisive. But the non-voter may be very decisive. That is, they want to vote against all the candidates, the Republican, the Democrat, and they haven't got an opportunity to do so. Nevada is the only state that has none of the above, but it's not binding. But there are times when even a binding none of the above vote in Nevada got more votes than won several candidates on the ballot. Now, there are civil liberty types who object to this. They say it's not fair. But I think it is very fair because it registers a statement that says to the parties, I'm not going to participate in your charade, and I am going to join none of the above voters in dumping your election and requiring new candidates and new elections. We have an action manual on how to publicize and promote a none of the above reform in your state. And if you're interested in getting a free copy of this manual, just go to nader.org and ask for it.
I think we have time for one more question. This is from Ramkumar Perumal. He's from Canada, actually, and he asks, are you a vegan, sir? If you aren't, I still don't imagine that you eat much meat or dairy anyway. Would you be willing to come out and endorse a switch to a plant-based diet in the interest of food justice, taking urgent action on climate change, enabling more people to take farming, reducing medical risks, and for a number of other reasons?
I'm heavy into fruits and vegetables. I don't eat red meat. I do eat fish, and I do like eggs, and I'm increasingly preferring hemp milk to dairy milk. So I'm almost there, but I think there's a certain level of dispute among nutritionists as to whether a vegan diet is completely sufficient over the long run. But there are wonderful recipes, delicious recipes now developing in vegan diets that would render any traditional objection that vegetable meals are not very tasty. There are cookbooks now that provide incredibly tasty as well as nutritious diets. They'll be good for the world and for the planet and reduce the horror that is inflicted on animals.
David, you're vegan, right?
I try to be vegan. It's hard.
You mean until you go past a McDonald's? Is that it, Donald?
No, and by the way, McDonald's is losing money, as is Coca-Cola. Speaking earlier to I think that has a lot to do with the work of you and our guest.
Well, it's interesting. Years ago, I marked the news report that said that Americans drink more soft drinks than water. Well, now it is the reverse, partly because of the availability of and promotion for bottled water, which is very expensive compared to tap water. The interesting thing is that some people are losing their taste for soft drinks and the effect on obesity and the effect on other aspects of human health.
The genius of Coca-Cola is they add salt so you don't taste all the sugar, and it makes you thirstier. They're brilliant. The formula is brilliant. So you think you're quenching your thirst, but you're getting thirstier as you drink the Coke. They are brilliant.
That summarizes the marketing genius of Coca-Cola, but they're facing increasingly hard times along with Pepsi. They'll probably come up with something.
Which is good.
My family is vegetarian. I'm vegetarian. My wife is vegan. Both my kids are. And I remember my daughter, when she was 8 years old, she was trying to be vegetarian. She was struggling with it. And she said, she was 8 years old. She said, "Dad, I'm a vegetarian except for my favorite food, steak." But she came around, and we've come around. We've come around full circle. I want to thank Frances Crowe for being our guest today. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. On behalf of David Feldman and Ralph Nader, my name is Steve Scrovan. Join us again next week. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you, David. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, our audience.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long. Steve's in the temple, too much money changing.